What if one of the richest men in the city chose to be homeless, just to see if kindness still existed? Evan Mercer was a billionaire with 4 months left to live, and no one to call. So he disappeared into the streets as a nobody. No money. No identity. No protection. What happened next changed not just his life, but the life of the man who showed him kindness when the world looked away. The headlines that morning called him a genius. Evan Mercer, CEO, market disruptor, the man who bent uncertainty to discipline and controlled outcomes. But there he sat, the only man in his billion-dollar empire who knew he was dying alone. The doctor didn't rush the words. Serious conversations never lived in quick sentences. 4 months, he said quietly. Maybe a little more. But we are no longer fighting for time, only comfort. He had spent 40 years controlling everything. Nothing in his life ever arrived without negotiation. Except this. He didn't argue. Didn't bargain. There was nothing to trade. He shook the doctor's hand with the same restraint he used in boardrooms, steady, composed, unreadable. But when the elevator doors closed, and there were no eyes to witness him, his grip trembled around the rail. At home, the city looked different. Seattle still moved, ferries cutting through gray water, brake lights crawling in the rain, lives overlapping below his penthouse glass. But the world no longer included him in its future. That night he tried to work. Emails. Calendar. Contracts. The same life that always made sense. But the numbers blurred. Work suddenly felt like a man dressing the dead. He cooked himself dinner, set out 1 plate, 1 fork, 1 napkin. Tonight, solitude wasn't peace. It was a verdict. He reached for his phone, pausing over a contact list full of names that meant nothing now. 4 months. 4 months to understand what a life meant when stripped of function and titles. 4 months to figure out why success had left him without a single person to sit beside him tonight. For a while, Evan did what people like him always did, he kept moving. The calendar filled itself, the same way it always had. Meetings. Calls. Strategy reviews. Nothing in his schedule had room for dying. Secrecy was a form of control. And control was the only thing he had left. Routine blurred the edges of the diagnosis. But then came the quiet hours, the elevator rides alone, the slow realization that the world would continue seamlessly without him. Each night, the same ritual, microwave dinner, 1 plate, muted television. Words that once defined purpose now sounded like background noise. By the 3rd week, he called his attorney. They discussed trusts, asset transfers, endowments. Each option had a clause, a beneficiary, a tax advantage. None of it sounded like meaning. Just administration. He signed the papers anyway. When it was over, the lawyer asked politely, "Would you like to attach any personal statement to the will, sir?" Something reflective. Evan told him no. He sat there staring at his own signature. His name carried enormous weight on those pages, billions in assets, yet in that moment, it felt like the name of a stranger. Over the next few days, he started watching people differently. The janitor who greeted him. The barista who smiled. An intern who picked up dropped papers. Small gestures he had never noticed before began to stay with him. Kindness, quiet, unmeasured. He couldn't remember the last time he'd offered any himself. One evening, leaving the office, he saw a man standing in the rain by a bus stop, holding an umbrella over an elderly woman. It was such a small thing, simple, human. That night, for the first time since his diagnosis, he let himself cry. Not from fear of death, but from the sudden clarity that, in all his success, he had lived without tenderness. The next morning, he canceled his meetings. He spent hours walking downtown, unnoticed. And as he walked, an idea began to take shape, tentative, irrational, but alive. If he wanted to understand kindness, he'd have to go where it still existed without reward. He'd have to see the world as a man with nothing. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday. Evan was leaving the office when he overheard two junior analysts in the hallway, young, laughing, talking about weekend plans and someone's birthday dinner. Nothing profound. Just life moving forward with effortless warmth. He paused, out of sight. Something inside him tightened, a reminder that the world had places he would never stand in again. The laughter faded behind the closing elevator doors, and he felt a strange hollowness open in his chest. 4 months left, and not one person on earth whose life he filled with that kind of lightness. That was the moment the idea stopped being a thought. It became a decision. He would step outside everything he built. Not to punish himself. Not to escape. But to see whether he could find kindness in the world where nobody expected anything from him, and when he had nothing to give back. He would strip himself of all his privileges, and become a homeless man on the streets of Seattle. The next morning, Evan sent a brief, formal memo to his board stating he was taking an immediate, indefinite sabbatical for a private health matter, transferring all executive authority until his return. It was simple and final. He began quietly preparing, not like a man planning an adventure, but like a man planning a surrender. He withdrew cash in small amounts over days. Enough to eat simply. To survive without drawing eyes. He bought plain clothes no one would look at twice, a worn jacket, faded jeans, a beanie that could belong to anyone. He practiced stillness in front of a mirror until the posture of wealth softened into the posture of someone the world overlooks. He walked. Down the elevator. Through the lobby. Past the doorman who nodded out of habit, unaware that the man passing him was stepping out of his life entirely. No luggage. No phone. Just a small backpack slung over one shoulder, and a mind stripped to essentials. Outside, Seattle breathed differently at street level, damp sidewalks, the low hum of buses. For once, he had nowhere to be at all. He walked for hours, until the buildings grew humbler, the streets less polished. A neighborhood where dignity was quiet and survival was steady work. By evening, rain began to fall, thin and persistent. He found a small patch beside an alley near an old auto shop. Enough shelter to pitch a modest tent without being disturbed. He didn't feel heroic. He only felt human. And frighteningly vulnerable. He zipped the tent closed, sat cross-legged on the sleeping bag, and listened to the rain tap rhythmically on nylon. For the first time in decades, no one needed anything from him. Just a man, alone, with one question: would anyone see him, when he was nobody at all? The first night passed quietly. Cold seeped through the sleeping bag in slow waves. Morning came without ceremony. Feet passed his tent. A dog barked. He sat outside on an overturned milk crate, hands wrapped around a paper cup of cheap coffee, watching the city wake up. No one looked at him. And strangely, that was a comfort. He wasn't being avoided, he was simply part of the background now. Invisibility had a raw honesty to it. Days blurred into one another. He walked, ate sparingly, slept lightly as city sounds moved around him. He learned quickly, people don't hate the homeless. Most are simply afraid of what it means that they could be one unfair break away from the same fate. Fear looks like indifference more than cruelty. On the 4th evening, after a thin dinner eaten alone, he returned to the quiet side street. Feet approached behind him, steady, tired steps. A young man walked by, dressed in kitchen whites, apron rolled in his hand. Face drawn with exhaustion, the kind earned by honest work. He glanced at Evan briefly, and instead of looking through him the way everyone else had, he gave a small nod. A simple acknowledgement. Like one human recognizing another. No pity. No curiosity. Just respect. Evan blinked. All day he had been a shadow, and in one quiet moment, someone had seen him. The man continued walking, footsteps fading into the drizzle. Evan sat there longer than he meant to, It was only a nod. But the next day, when the same footsteps returned, Evan found himself looking up, waiting. If you're still watching, thank you. Stories like this take time to unfold, and your support helps them reach people who need them. Please like this video and subscribe, it helps us keep telling human stories that matter. The next evening arrived the same way the last one had, slowly, with a damp chill settling over the street. Evan sat by his tent again. His stomach ached, partly hunger, partly the new reality that he couldn't just walk into a restaurant anymore. He heard the footsteps again. Same shoes. Same pace. Same tired gait. Daniel walked past, head down, bag slung over one shoulder. This time he slowed slightly, looking at Evan a beat longer than last night. "Evening," he said quietly. Evan nodded. "Evening." Daniel hesitated, that brief internal debate between do something and mind your business. Whatever pushed him forward won by a thin margin. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small plastic container. "Got extra from the kitchen," he said, almost apologetic. "Chicken and rice. Nothing special." He held it out, arm steady, voice casual, like it was no big deal. Evan didn't take it at first. Years of being self-reliant made the gesture feel unfamiliar. "You sure?" Evan asked. Daniel shrugged. "Yeah. Otherwise, it just sits in the fridge. Better someone eats it." Evan finally accepted the container, fingers slightly stiff from the cold. "Thank you," he said. The words felt heavier than they should have. Daniel nodded once and continued walking. No advice. No pity. Just a man heading home after a long shift, trying to do one decent thing before he ended his day. Evan sat still for a moment. The food was warm. He didn't eat immediately, he simply held it, letting the warmth settle into his palms. He had spent his life feeding industries, economies, balance sheets. Now someone had fed him. No recognition required. No leverage. No return. Just a simple act of kindness. He ate slowly. When he finished, he closed the empty container neatly, placed it beside him, and sat back. Tomorrow, he didn't hope for another meal. But he realized he was hoping for another nod. The rain eased up for a few days. Evan had settled into a rhythm. He learned where he could get a cheap cup of coffee, which benches stayed dry, which corners the city ignored. Daniel's route never changed. He worked the late shift and walked home around 11. Each night he'd pass, sometimes wave, sometimes exchange short words. Nothing planned, just habit forming out of repetition. Daniel slowed again, saw Evan sitting on the curb with a steaming paper cup. "You get coffee there?" he asked, nodding toward the small shop at the corner. "Yeah," Evan said. "They charge half the price if you bring your own cup." Daniel smiled faintly. "That's smart." A pause. Daniel sighed, rubbing his forehead. "They added another hour to my shift. My feet are killing me." Evan nodded. "That's rough." "It'll pass," Daniel said, shaking off the fatigue. "I've got an old blanket here for you," he said. "It is not much, but against the cold, it is something." Evan tried to refuse. "You don't have to." "I know," Daniel said. "But it's better in use than in my closet." That was it. Over the next week, they talked a little more each time. Daniel told him he cooked back home. "Now I just wash dishes," he said. "Still smells like food, though." Evan asked, "You miss it?" Daniel thought for a second. "Yeah. Cooking's steady. You follow steps, things come together. Life's not always like that." Some nights Daniel brought leftovers again. He never asked for anything in return. And Evan, careful not to appear dependent, started saving half his small coffee to offer Daniel when he passed. The routine became wordless understanding, one man finishing work, another finishing the day, both meeting in the narrow space between fatigue and silence. What surprised Evan most wasn't the food, or the kindness. It was how natural the company felt. No introductions. No roles. Just two men whose worlds shouldn't have crossed, sitting under the same dull streetlight. For the first time in years, conversation didn't feel like negotiation. Evan didn't stop watching the world. Old instincts didn't disappear just because the stakes had changed. He had built his empire by studying people, and he found himself doing it again now, only from a different vantage point. A charity van parked near the underpass one afternoon. Volunteers set out sandwiches, bottled water. When it was his turn, a woman in a bright vest handed him a bag without meeting his eyes. "Next, please." The kindness felt mechanical, like it had been processed, boxed, and handed out on schedule. He sat eating slowly, thinking about the difference between feeding people and caring if they ate. He realized the truth: most people weren't cruel, they were just busy surviving their own lives. The cough had been building for days, but he ignored it. He told himself it was the cold, the damp air. But one evening, as the sky darkened and the temperature fell, he felt a sharp pull under his ribs that wouldn't ease. By the time Daniel came down the street, Evan was sitting on the pavement, trying to steady his breath. Daniel stopped immediately. "You, okay?" he asked, crouching beside him. Evan managed a small nod that fooled neither of them. Daniel didn't ask permission. He put the coffee he was carrying down, unzipped his backpack, and pulled out a bottle of water. "Here." "Slow," he said, watching until Evan drank. When the coughing eased, Daniel sat next to him. Neither spoke for a while. "You should get looked at," Daniel said finally. "There's a clinic on Pine." Evan shook his head. "It'll pass." Daniel gave a short, quiet sigh. He stayed there anyway. 15 minutes. Maybe more. Just sitting, making sure the breathing didn't turn worse. When he stood to leave, he added, "I'll check in tomorrow. Just in case." It was said casually, like he was commenting on the weather. But Evan heard the meaning behind it. Someone would come back. Someone cared if he was still breathing in the morning. The next evening, Daniel found the tent gone. For a moment he thought Evan had moved on or worse. Then he saw him sitting on the bench a few yards away, wearing clean clothes, his face clearer, wearing a broad smile. Daniel stopped. "You all right? You look different." Evan nodded. "Yeah, never been better." Then he said, "Would you come with me? There's something I need to show you." Daniel agreed, mostly out of concern. Evan's voice had that faint, end of something tone he couldn't ignore. Evan flagged down a yellow taxi, and as they settled in, he slipped a folded note with an address to the driver. Daniel glanced sideways. "Where are we headed?" "Somewhere warm," Evan said. The ride was quiet. Outside the window, the city changed in slow layers, cracked sidewalks giving way to manicured hedges, graffiti to mirrored glass. Daniel watched the shift with unease. These were the kinds of streets where people like him kept their heads down and moved quickly. It wasn't a neighborhood for ordinary men. "Evan," he said at last, "where are we going?" The taxi stopped in front of a glass-walled tower overlooking the bay, one of those places that seemed to belong to another species of life entirely. Evan paid with a few rumpled bills, thanked the driver softly, and motioned for Daniel to follow. Daniel hesitated at the marble lobby. "We can't go in there." "Yes, we can," Evan said gently. No one stopped them. The doorman merely nodded as if greeting a familiar face. Upstairs, the elevator opened into silence and light. The penthouse felt unreal, airy, polished, filled with the faint scent of wood and rain. Daniel turned in slow disbelief, taking in the floor-to-ceiling view, the artwork, the quiet hum of wealth. Evan stood by the counter. "This was my life," he said. He hesitated. My name isn't just Evan. It's Evan Mercer. Daniel blinked. The CEO. Evan nodded once. That one. Daniel's confusion deepened. I don't understand, he said. What were you doing in the streets, sleeping in a tent? Evan exhaled, the words measured. I needed to see the world stripped of everything I owned, to know what people looked like when I couldn't buy their kindness. Daniel frowned, the hurt just beneath his voice. You risked your life to see if kindness existed on the streets. All this time I thought you needed comfort, you were. Evan met his eyes. I risked my life to stop lying to myself. I'd built walls so high I couldn't see what mattered anymore. Out there, I finally could. He poured 2 cups of coffee and slid one toward Daniel. Money changes how people look at you. I needed someone who wouldn't. He reached into his coat and placed an envelope on the counter. I'm leaving the city soon. There's a lease in here for a small restaurant space. Funds to start it. It's yours, if you'll take it. Daniel didn't open it right away. I don't understand, he said again, quieter this time. Why me? Evan's voice stayed calm. Because you were kind when no one was watching. You gave me a warm meal when the world thought I was an inconvenience. You reminded me what being seen feels like. Daniel shook his head slowly. I wasn't kind because I hoped for a reward, Evan. I was just being human. I know, Evan said, his smile faint and real. That's what made it worth everything. Daniel's eyes softened. You know I can't repay this. Evan's answer came like an exhale. You already did. When Daniel finally stepped into the elevator, neither man said goodbye. The doors slid shut, quiet, decisive, like the last page of a story that neither of them wanted to end. The space was small but beautiful in its simplicity, polished wood counters, clean walls, a few plants catching light from the front window. Daniel had spent the money carefully. The sign above the door read Grace Table. Underneath, in smaller letters, everyone is welcome. Opening day came quietly. No ribbon cutting, no press. Just the smell of stew simmering and bread warming in the oven. A chalkboard near the counter carried the only rule, pay what you can. When the first customer appeared, a man hesitant at the threshold, clothes damp from the rain, Daniel stepped forward. Come in, he said. You look cold. Daniel served him coffee and a bowl of soup, no questions asked. When the man reached for his pocket, Daniel shook his head. Eat first, he said. That's how we do it here. Later, Daniel locked the register, wiped the counter, and looked around the room. Nothing extravagant, just a working kitchen, good light, and a space that hummed with quiet purpose. Exactly what Evan had wanted him to build. A week later a letter arrived. Daniel. I saw the photos. It's better than I imagined, warm, honest, alive. Good luck with the kitchen. And thank you for seeing me when no one else did. E.M. That night, as he turned the sign to closed, he set one plate at the corner table for himself. The kitchen smelled of spice and bread. Inside, Grace's table glowed with quiet light, not a monument to charity, but to decency. He had set out looking for kindness. Not the kind written in checks or carved into marble, but the kind that lives quietly in ordinary people, in small gestures, in decency without an audience. Evan Mercer found it, not in the towers he built, but in a tired man walking home after work, a man who offered food without asking a name. And in that exchange, both men were changed, one learning that wealth could finally serve a purpose, the other discovering that kindness, when trusted, could grow into something lasting. The restaurant still stands on a quiet Seattle street. No advertisements. No fanfare. Just the smell of soup, the sound of rain, and a small plaque by the door that says, Grace Table, built on the simple belief that everyone deserves to be seen. Thank you for watching till the end. If this story moved you, Please like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more powerful human stories every week. And if you want YouTube to recommend our next upload to you, turn on notifications, it really helps.